I would have done calculations back in January, and I was looking at kind of a nitrogen cost of about 150 and a phosphorus of about 260 per kg. But nitrogen, based on what I found out today, and CAN is currently 185 per kg of nitrogen, and the phosphorus based around the compounds is up at nearly 370. So it's jumped a whole euro for phosphorus. So yeah, it is absolutely, it's expensive.
Soils are the lifeblood of every tillage farm. If soils aren't functioning well, they simply won't deliver high yields, and profitability on farm depends on this. Maintaining healthy soils takes active management, both in the office and out in the field. The question is, do you know which parts of your farm needs most attention to bring them up to the best possible condition? You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying this series, we'd appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. The recent soil test results report has just been published, and I'm delighted to be joined by its author, Veronica Nyhan, a soil and plant specialist with Teagasc, to talk us through the findings. Veronica, you just launched the Soils Database report. For you, what are the key points within that report for the 2025 soil results?
I suppose one of the key highlights is a parameter that we have used repeatedly over a number of years, and that is optimal fertility, which I suppose we probably misnamed and is more nutrient sufficiency. So the amount of soils that have a pH above 6.2, but also have a P and K index of both 3 or 4. And that has gone up by 5% this year on 2024. So it's up at 25% now. Soil pH has also shown an improvement. We are down at 44% of the soils tested at index or below a pH of 6.2, which is down from 52% in 2024. The amount of soils testing at index 1 or 2 for P is about 43%. Again, that's a 9% reduction on what we had in 2024, and 41% tested at index 1 or 2 for K, which is down 2% on 2024.
Just with all those figures, you might just remind everybody what soil or what the indexes mean. Is one good or is one bad?
So for pH below 6.2 is where we'd start to see nutrient lockup, particularly of phosphorus and nutrients that we want in high availability becoming less available, and nutrients that we don't want a lot of in the soil becoming more available. So it's not a good thing. And that's at 44% now. And index 1 and 2 would mean that the nutrient is low or very low in that particular nutrient. So all the figures represent the I suppose what would be reduced fertility or suboptimal. But look, I suppose to push, so it sounds like things are improving, and they are, but it's important to recognise that 2024 was a scheme year. So we had about 70,000 samples went through the system. And of those, over 60% were represented by dry stock samples, which were bought in by the acre scheme and may have represented more marginal land where high pH would be, a high acidity or a low pH would probably be a good thing, i.e. peaty soils or soils that are extensive grassland, acid, mineral, like habitats or biodiverse ecosystems. In 2025, the number of soil samples was just over 39,000, and about 47% were represented by dairy samples. And that as a sector is a sector that has shown, increased uptake of liming because it's part and parcel of certain schemes related to dairy. So there's higher lime usage, and they also have a much higher P balance relative to, according to the National Farm Survey, relative to dry stock and tillage systems. So they have a surplus of phosphorus coming into their systems, which can explain they had a significantly higher improvement, and they may have skewed the national results slightly to a positive. But it's worth also noting, though, that they have a much higher level of index 4 soils in the dairy system as well. So they're nearly improving it to the point where it's becoming a problem.
Okay, they don't necessarily need all that P, and they probably should think about how they can,
Yeah,
I
so
suppose, better
for
distribute it or distribute it elsewhere, I suppose. But more specifically, rather than dairy, and people be kind of going mad here and they was talking about dairy. And let's get back onto tillage for a second. If we look more, I think you mentioned there's a lot of dairy samples, a lot of grass samples in general, so there's dairy or dry stock in it. But there are
yes,
tillage samples in it though.
yes.
What are the samples telling us around tillage?
So the tillage samples represented about 10% of the data set that came in 2025. They are about 30%. So remember, the national average was 25% had that sufficient nutrient sufficiency. So 30% of the tillage samples hit that. 36% had a pH below 6.5. So we've upped now the requirement. Actually, only 18% were below 6.2, but because tillage crops tend to like slightly higher pH, we look at 6.5 as the drop off for that. So a lot of them nutrient sufficient. And in fact, we have a disproportionate amount of the samples coming from the tillage side of the house are testing above a pH of 7. So above a pH of 7, we will start to see problems with P lockup again, like we see in acid soils. And we'll also see a lockup of certain trace elements like manganese and some of the other copper and zinc to a certain degree. Surprisingly, or like concerningly, 54% of the soil, so over half the soils that came in classified as tillage, uh, tested at a P index 1 or 2, which is low or very low. Now it's slightly better than last year, down 2%, but it's still over half our soils are insufficient for phosphorus. Um, when we look at the amount in that are low for in index 1 or 2 for K, it's 37%. So there are problems.
Yeah, so Veronica, then with the P, the concerning bit you talked about there is in the
Mm.
amount of soils that have a low P index. Is there a likelihood that that's going to restrict yield? Or maybe in the other side of it, maybe it's not if a farmer's willing to put enough fertilizer on that field in a particular year.
Well, look, a high index 2 can be as productive as a low index 3. The line is it's a it's hard to quantify the line, and soil type as well will have a certain impact on that. But definitely index 1s you would be expecting to see some compromise in yield, and low index 2s. I do appreciate that when you're in an index 2 and a high index 2, and some farmers like to be in that position because it means that they are allowed to import higher levels of organic manure. So if you can maintain a high index 2, I wouldn't have a concern. But we do have a lot that are still index 1, and they would be underperforming.
And in terms of underperforming, there would be work, am I right in saying that would show that this, even if you put a huge amount of P onto a soil that's in an index 1 scenario, you're not going to get the same amount of yield as if that soil was an index 3 in the first place.
Yes, and you're also likely to not get as good a response to applied nitrogen as well, because the crop is underperforming in the sense that it's and certain crops will feel it more, like your legumes, your beans, peas particularly will struggle with those low P indexes.
Okay. So you're saying that farmers can work on maybe the higher end of index too. So you're talking about something like, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6, maybe somewhere
Yeah.
around there, maybe in terms of the actual hard result that a farmer gets back. What about potash or maybe even indeed you mentioned earlier the pH? Is pH a bit more restrictive? But could you work outside that in terms of potash?
Potash is it's interesting. There's some of the research that was done on very low, what we've thought were cave fixing soils has shown that despite the fact that there seems to be no buildup, they're still generating very high yields. This goes back to research conducted by a colleague in Johnstone Castle, Thomas McCarthy. He looked at soils in the Midland that were thought to be cave fixing and found that they weren't compromised on yield, and felt that a lot of it was to do with the fact that they're just very, very free draining soils, very low cation exchange capacity. So they have very poor ability to retain potassium, but that they respond very well to potassium applied. I suppose a lot of the farmers farming some of those soils have modified their fertilization strategies to maybe not front load massive amounts early on, because as I said, free draining soils or K fixing soils, high applications may not become plant available, as they may be lost from the system or locked up. So some farmers that are farming these kind of soils will often apply an NK kind of fertilizer strategy as they move through the season, rather than front loading high quantities into the whole supply into the seedbed or at the start of the season.
You mentioned high yields there, and farmers can get higher yields. Last year there was it was a pretty good yielding year, and there was some very high yields taken off a number of soils. What happens in those soils? Is there a likelihood that there's a bit of mining going on in those really high years, or is there what's the farmer do about it, I suppose, one year to the next?
Definitely when you're high yielding, and that is why in your calculation for allowances, you take account of your bonus yield allowance, because if you're generating very high yielding crops, you need to replenish the soil as a result. We do know, or our current figures are based on an offtake of 3.8 kgs of phosphorus per ton of yield, and between 10 and 15 kgs of potassium, depending on whether it's a winter cereal or you're talking about oats, for example, would be slightly higher. And if you're not chopping straw, those are very high offtakes off the system. So I suppose it's just a case of having accurate soil samples and doing a nutrient management plan and keeping on top of your fertilization strategy, and making sure that you're keeping account of your bonus yield allowance, because you must remember, especially for phosphorus, your allowance is calculated off a yield of 6.5 tons per hectare, which in a case of a winter system means you are immediately under fertilizing unless you can show that you have a yield above that. And the department allows you to fertilize to offtake to prevent mining of nutrients in the soil.
And in a high yielding situation, it could nearly be maybe not quite twice the allowance, but it can be getting close to it if you're, in a very high yielding
Yeah,
situation the previous year.
absolutely. And look, the reality is with the National Fertilizer Database now, you don't want to be guessing with these things. You need to be accurate in what you're buying and what you're applying. And without a nutrient management plan, it really, you probably are losing out either in under fertilizing and loss of production, or you're running the risk of over fertilizing and breaching allowances and getting penalties as a result.
So many farmers listening to this will probably be thinking, yeah, that's all well and fine, Veronica, all this replacement scenario, but that's expensive.
It
Cost of
is.
fertilizer with the recent war, I suppose, is still going on across in the Middle East. Fertilizer prices have only gone one way, and that all costs money. I suppose, in a general sense, how much have fertilizer prices risen in the last 2 weeks?
I would have done calculations back in January before CBAM was applied, and I was looking at a kind of a nitrogen cost of about 150 and phosphorus of about 260 per kg. Today, I just rang around. I found it hard to get a potassium value. I think potassium hasn't changed as drastically, but nitrogen, based on what I found out today, and this is using CAN now, I'm not going to even address urea because that's kind of in a world of its own. But CAN is currently 185, worth 185 per kg of nitrogen, and the phosphorus based around the compounds is up at nearly 370. So it's jumped a whole euro for phosphorus. So yeah, it is absolutely, it's expensive. And the last time we saw prices of fertilizer soar like this, and a P went over €4 a kg, we saw a massive drop in the utilization of P and K fertilizers. And we've actually only, this year is the first year, or sorry, last year was the first year we saw the P start to show an upward trend in sales. So look, I suppose, the reality is you're going to be using fertilizer, make sure you use it appropriately, make the most out of it. If you can, if you're sowing and have access to a seed and fertile drill placement, makes a little bit of an impact, makes it work more effectively. But look, not everyone has that. Um, don't be applying chemical fertilizer or chemical nitrogen saturated fields. Apply them when the crop is actively growing, all of these parameters. But look, I'd really be suggesting people look for alternative supplies, cheaper supplies, and that is looking into the organic manures market. Today alone, like based on these prices, the value of cattle slurry has gone up by about €4 per 1,000 gallons. And that's the high N and the high P fertilizers, like for example the broiler litters and the types like that, have gone up by about €11 per ton. So it's a substantial increase in the value of them, and they are an alternative source of nutrients to you in your system.
And I suppose, look, that's kind of all well and fine. A lot of people are probably thinking to themselves, you can either get them or maybe you can't. But if somebody was, looking at maybe trying to get some organic manures locally, what is generally most, I suppose, available in localities? Or is that too hard a question to answer? It depends on where you are, maybe.
It really does depend on where you are. Look, I suppose I would be looking for the best bang for your buck at the minute. And if you do have access to pig slurry, for example, poultry manure, they're two very high. They'd have high availability of nitrogen, and they would have high P levels as well. Um, if you're going for a slurry or a manure, it's important to make sure that it's a high dry matter. You don't want to be buying a lot of water and paying for the transport of it. We do know that the nutrient value of organic manures correlates to the dry matter content. So it's important that you're buying, fairly good quality, high dry matter material. The reality is the paper value of the manure, say cattle slurry you buy, is at 6% dry matter. And that's what you have to reduce your allowances for, if dependent on or with an expectation that it's at 6% and it's containing 1 kg per ton of available nitrogen. If it's actually at 2%, it's way less than that. So you're taking, you're not getting what you're accounting for in your book value.
And that's all the more important, I suppose, today, given the fact that a farm has a total allowance based on what we talked about earlier in terms of total yield and indices and that. So
Yeah.
balancing all that out is pretty important between organic manures and the chemical fertilizer being bought.
It is. And also the organic manures bring so many more positive additives to the situation as well. They bring trace elements, they bring organic carbons, which feed soil biology, which help it speed up the breakdown of these things. And they bring soil carbon, which helps build your soil structure. The benefits are endless, really. So they are the all round the better option. It's just availability to get your hands on them.
So finally, Veronica, if a farmer can get their hands on organic manures, is there a specific part of the farm they should target first?
Well, we'd always recommend that you target your lowest index for phosphorus, because that is your most expensive nutrient to build up. And then if you want to get really bespoke about the whole thing, cattle slurry is very high K, has a higher K portion of potassium in it. If you're looking for, pig slurry might be have a better blend for building a phosphorus in a soil. But look, beggars can't be choosers. I think the demand or the respect for organic manures is going to go up massively in coming weeks if things keep progressing the way they're going. So any kind of high quality or pretty robust dry matter organic manure is better than nothing.
This Veronica is always a mind of information. Thank you very much. And look, we'll be talking to you again throughout the season.
Thanks.
So that's it for this episode. And my thanks to Veronica for joining me on the show. If you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. And I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.